Good. Okay, well, hello everybody. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AAA Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present. And a very warm welcome to all of you. We don't, as you may know, normally do things on a Friday, and we've an absolute great turnout. That's testament, I think, both to the topic, but particularly our speaker. I'd also acknowledge representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the diplomatic community joining us here and on the online audience. We're here today to talk about America's evolving relationship with China, from engagement to disengagement. And obviously, it's an absolutely critical relationship in this time of geopolitical tensions, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have the insights of a visitor from the US. Professor David Shambaugh from George Washington University is an internationally recognized scholar and acclaimed award-winning author, and he'll be introduced more fully by longtime friend and China expert, Professor John Fitzgerald. John ran the Ford Foundation in China for many years. Likewise, he's also an acclaimed author. And John, I will hand over to you to talk a little bit more about what we will cover today. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Alistair. Well, it's with very great pleasure that we welcome Professor David Shambaugh to Melbourne once again. This is his third visit to Melbourne, and on this occasion as a guest of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. For myself, it's a particular honour to introduce David to the AIIA community here in Melbourne, which hosts many of the big conversations in this city on international affairs in this wonderful downtown venue. Thank you to the AIIA for hosting this event. Professor Shambaugh is Gaston Seeger Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science and International Affairs in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's also founding director of the China Policy Program at GWU. He's a distinguished fellow currently with the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, and for a decade or more, from 1996 to 2016, he was non-resident senior fellow in the Brookings Institute in DC, the switch clearly from the east to the west coast to the Hoover Institution. He was previously professor in the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, where he edited the China Quarterly, one of the two top journals of China studies in the world today, in the English language at any rate. He served on the board of directors of the National Committee on US-China Relations, on the advisory board of the National Bureau of Asian Research, on the East-West Center Fellowship Board, and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of its Board of Studies. This is among many other public policy and scholarly organizations. I list them here not just formally to welcome and introduce David, but also to indicate how closely engaged he has been in the engagement story between the United States and China from then to now. As an author over this period, he's published more than 30 books, I think possibly 35, which I figured about one page a day over the last 40 years, but including most recently, Breaking the Engagement, How China Won and Lost America. Recent books include China's Leaders, From Mao to Now, Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia, and China in the World, all these just in the last 5 years. His books, including China's Future, has been selected by many leading journals for best books of the year. The Economist, for example, Foreign Affairs, and Bloomberg have routinely listed his books among the best of the year. And he was a runner-up for the Asia Society's Bernard Schwartz Prize. I shan't list his enormous bibliography at this point. I commend it to you. Needless to say, he's also authored many articles and reports, very important scholarly articles, which those who teach and research China have learned a great deal about. He graduated in East Asian Studies from the Elliott School of International Affairs at GWU and earned his MA from Johns Hopkins, the Knight School of Advanced International Studies, or SAS, and his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Now, to myself and many of us here, David's more than a renowned and widely quoted researcher, analyst, and scholar. He's also an old friend of Australia and of a number of good friends here in Australia, and a dear friend to myself and Antonia, and to others in this room as well. The topic of David's talk today, from engagement to disengagement, America's evolving relations with China, draws on this book, which will be available in Australia in the near future, but not quite yet. Now, this topic is very close to David's heart, and I know this from personal observation. He's been a keen participant observer of the engagement and disengagement over this period. And one of the first really to call out and note signs of that disengagement well over a decade ago. We first met in Beijing shortly after the global financial crisis, when America, the United States, was falling rapidly out of favor in China. At the time of the GFC, I often heard a refrain circulating in policy circles, I was working there at the time, that went something like this: we no longer have a teacher. And this was spoken in a tone of sort of astonishment and disappointment in policy circles. It indicated, in fact, it referred to Washington and its Wall Street advisors as really losing all credibility among policy analysts, policy makers in the People's Republic, particularly on the reform side of the agenda. And in fact, former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson records that he was taken aside by Vice Premier Wang Qishan at one of the US-China Strategic Economic Dialogues around that time, and told by Wang that China once regarded the United States as a teacher. No longer, he said, I quote, we aren't sure we should be learning anything from you anymore. Quoting Paulson. Now, in a country where authority is conventionally grounded in that kind of classroom archetype of teacher-pupil relations, this is a serious reflection on the part of China's policy elites. And of course, if you're not a teacher, then you're a pupil. And if you're not a pupil, if you have no teacher, you are the teacher. So since then, China has been teaching all of us a number of very serious lessons, some of them very uncomfortable, including our colleagues in the United States. David experienced some of these dismissive remarks firsthand during his time attached to the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing at that time. But well over a decade has passed since then. What's David learnt? I mean, he was among the first to call it out, I think, back then. What has he learned since then? How has he reflected on it? And what can he teach us? Please lend a hand of welcome to David. Sit up, hands behind back. David is our teacher. Welcome, David.
Well, John, I really am absolutely delighted. Well, I should say Alistair first. I'm delighted to be here at the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Melbourne. My first visit to the Institute, but as John just said, my third over 3 decades really to Melbourne, but by no means first to Australia. I think maybe 9th or 10th. I love coming down under. It's a bit of a change from summer in North America to winter here, but thank you all for coming today, first of all, and those who are watching online. And John, thank you for your very kind, gracious introduction. Indeed, very heartfelt. We have been friends and colleagues for some time. We met first, I remember, when I was at SOAS in London, and then we really renewed and developed and deepened our friendship in Beijing when you were Ford Foundation representative, and I was a senior Fulbright scholar at the Academy of Social Sciences that year, 2910. But couldn't ask for someone better to introduce me. So thank you. Great to see you. And thanks everybody for coming. You're here to hear about the US-China relationship, and I plan to discuss that, but really primarily through the prism of the American side of the relationship and American policy towards, strategy towards China over a long period of time. So what I'm going to say today, I'm sure there are some of you who will be curious about it or disagree with some of the way the Americans think about and have dealt with China. But I think nonetheless, it's an opportunity for you to understand how we Americans do think about China. At least this American. I can't represent others except myself, but and I'm going to do so through discussing my brand new book, which just was released in the last couple of weeks in the United States, but it is, I gather, physically available here. A couple of Australian colleagues have already received their copies. So, again, let me try and, oh, there's a clock, good. Let me give you sort of insights into how we Americans and the American government and American societal actors have engaged with, and more recently in the last decade, disengaged from the People's Republic of China. So this book, which I've been contemplating writing really for a number of years as I teach my annual graduate, postgraduate level seminar on US-China relations, this book was sort of stimulated by two puzzles that I've wrestled with and grappled with over many decades of teaching. One puzzle more historical, one more contemporary. The more historical one is why, or what I should say, have been the underlying sort of fundamental drivers of this relationship, the US-China relationship. Because if you study it over decades, if not centuries, and I think it's very important to study it over centuries, one notices that these overriding single characteristic of US-China relations is what? Fluctuation. This is anything but a steady, linear relationship. It has fluctuated repetitively from amity to enmity and back to amity, then to enmity, and the cycle seems to repeat itself at fairly regular intervals. This is a cycle that the late, and I think great historian Warren Cohen, American historian, who sadly just passed away about 6 weeks ago in Washington. But I have enormous respect for Warren's body of scholarship, but he wrote a great deal about US-China relations, and he was one of the first who noted this repetitive fluctuant cycle. He called it the love-hate cycle in US-China relations. Both sides loved the other, and both sides hated the other, and they would go back and forth. So it's not just the Americans loving and hating the Chinese, it was the reciprocated. So that, in fact, is the first historical puzzle and the subject of chapter 1 in the book, which I call Elusive Equilibrium. So in addition to puzzling about that more historical tendency, this second more contemporary puzzle that I've wrestled with in the last 10 years or so is why, after 4 decades, really, of the American so-called engagement with China, in which the American and Chinese societies and governments were very deeply intertwined with each other. Why, after 40 years of that, which was essentially a cooperative period, despite periodic frictions and occasional crises. No doubt about it, we've had our crises. But the general tendency has been towards a more cooperative relationship. So, but why over the last decade has that engagement given way to comprehensive competition between the United States and China, where frictions and systemic disengagement have become the overriding character? So we have 4 decades of engagement and, generally speaking, cooperative ties, followed by the last decade of disengagement and comprehensive competition. So, and how is it that China's previously positive image amongst the American public has taken a, I have some slides now, a nosedive over the, well, since really 2012, you can see a little bit of a dip around 2017-18 again. But today, or at the end of 2024, more than 80% of the American public, this is the Pew Research Center data, which is probably, I think, the most reputable polling data in the United States. Over 80%, I think 83% or so of Americans, the American public today, have an unfavorable view of China. 83%, that's pretty high. Moreover, if you can see this slide, 42% of the American public view China as an enemy. That's a strong word. Half, 50%, see China as a competitor, and only 6% see China as a partner. That tells you a lot, too. And you can see how that's changed over time. So that's the more contemporary puzzle. And the answer to both of these puzzles, and the basic argument of my book, is that over 4 decades, China won over America through its own generally reformist domestic policies and its foreign policies that coincided with American expectations of China and the premises on which the American engagement strategy was built. So it was a coincidence of American expectations, which is the independent variable, Chinese behavior and policies is the dependent variable. It's the interaction of those 2 variables that this book examines over a significant period of time. But in short, when China's policies and behavior coincided with American expectations, the 2 could cooperate and generally had non-conflictual relations. But when China did not conform to American expectations, frictions followed. Now I can hear you, some of you already thinking, why conform with American expectations? I'll come back to that in a minute. But whether you can pass a value subjective judgment on whether the American expectations were appropriate or not, it's an empirical fact. Americans had expectations and still do of China. Moreover, I found in the research for this book, ironically, that the deeper the engagement and the presence of each side in the other's country, the deeper the suspicions and the greater the frictions that emerged. Now, this is an irony. It's indeed counterintuitive, because engagement was premised on the liberal, with a capital L, assumption that the deeper and broader each side's presence in and interactions with the other, the greater the cooperation and the stronger the relationship would be. Well, I found, surprisingly, quite to the contrary. Beginning around 2010, a wide variety of American actors began to encounter considerably increased obstacles to their work in China. NGOs, I'd be very interested in John's own experience and views about this, because he represented one of, if not the leading American NGO in China, the Ford Foundation. But like we can discuss that either today or subsequently this weekend. But anyway, NGOs across a wide range of areas, not just foundations, began to encounter obstacles and impediments and increased controls to their normal work in the country. And why were they in the country? Because they were trying to help China. So NGOs, journalists who've never had an easy time in China, American companies, educational exchange organizations and universities, U.S. Embassy and consulates and a wide range of other American actors all began to encounter increased impediments and obstacles to what I say is their normal work in the country. So in retrospect, I think 2010 was a real turning point, and I have my theories about why. Some of it goes to John's observations about the global financial crisis, but there are more. And it was after that time, and this is 2 years before Xi Jinping became the leader of the country, folks. We all associate these repressive policies with Xi Jinping, right? Well, to be sure, they have increased dramatically, and Xi Jinping has doubled down on them, but they began in the last 2 years of the Hu Jintao regime. Anyway, I personally experienced it myself as a visiting scholar in the Academy of Social Sciences that year, which, you know, I should say they didn't do much to facilitate my research. I was working on my book, China Goes Global, at the time. They tried to impede it, and they certainly didn't facilitate it. Now, this is very odd because I'd had decades of interactions with the Academy of Social Sciences. This was not the first institute I was resident in. This was the 6th. I don't know any other foreigner who's been physically resident in 6 different CAS institutes. So they knew me well, I knew them well. Besides, I used to award or Ford Foundation fellowships. I don't know if you know this, John. I worked for Peter Geithner back in the 1980s when the Ford Foundation was beginning to train new generations of Chinese in 3 fields: law, economics, and international relations. I was in charge of the international relations program for a couple of years as a consultant. So, and CAS benefited enormously from that. So they knew me very well. So why, after all that, and my own whatever, they did not help. So 2010, looking back on it, there are a number of indicators. That was a turning point. Okay, then in 2012, Xi Jinping came to power. And over the last 13 years, these negative trends and obstacles have only dramatically increased. Domestically and externally, China's behavior has become what international China specialists call assertiveness and wolf warrior public diplomacy. Everything in China has become increasingly securitized, anquanhua in Chinese. In fact, national security is now the #1 national policy goal. Xi Jinping used that term, I think, something like 80 times in his last Party Congress speech. It has overtaken development, Bajan, as the leading national goal. National security, overtaking development, I repeat, and everything is securitized. There are now no fewer than 22 different categories of national security that Xi Jinping has come up with in his so-called comprehensive national security outlook. The 总体国家安全观, 22 categories. Each category has 5, 6, 7, 8 different elements. So this whole country is being securitized. And their foreign policy has been securitized. Moreover, during this same period, China has stepped up its own influence and interference activities in other countries, including the United States and Australia. In fact, Australia was the first to really call China out on these interference activities under former Prime Minister Turnbull. But this has become a phenomenon worldwide subsequently. Now I say stepped up. The Chinese have stepped up these interference activities, which has negatively affected different parts of American society, American states, universities, civil society, media, and our national security. China's been doing this stuff for a long time, but there was a real uptick. And they start getting caught. Their fingers in the cookie jar, so to speak, proverbially. As a result, the American government has also, like the Australian government, securitized the relationship, and for good reason. So mutual securitization, I argue in the book, has definitely contributed to the downward trend and disengagement of the relationship over the last 10 years. Both sides have some responsibility for this. Both see the other side as subversive. It's interesting. Now, and this is, I argue in the book, how China lost America, if you're wondering what the subtitle is all about. They won America through their reform policies and their foreign policies that coincided with American expectations, and they lost and have lost America, past tense. I don't think it's coming back, engagement, through their more malign activities and policies. So make no mistake, Xi Jinping broke the engagement with his policies. And this conclusion, excuse me, echoes my colleague Susan Schertz's recent book, which I commend to you, entitled Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise. Commend it to you if you haven't read it. Susan and I examined the same period of time, basically, come to the same conclusions, but looking at different elements. She looks more internally in China. I look more deeply internally in the United States. So they can be read in tandem. Now, as a result, the engagement strategy and what I call the engagement coalition of different actors in America has collapsed and been replaced by a strategy or a reality, really, of comprehensive competition and a new coalition that I describe as the counter-China coalition in the United States. That's what the book is basically about. Okay, so you may wonder, now what was this American strategy of engagement about in the first place? What were the Americans trying to do? Well, here, let me put this slide up. Okay, in short, this how I understand engagement. There is no secret single master document in the US National Archives that defines engagement. Every American administration, though, basically tweaked these 4 elements. First element, kind of Chinese, the 7 strategies and the 4 tactics, 4 strategies, excuse me, and the 7 tactics. So the 4 strategies, and here I'm talking about a very long period of time, going back at least to 1979 in the Carter administration when the US and China normalized diplomatic relations, but I would argue this goes back to the 18th century to modernize China economically and technologically, or to help China modernize itself economically and technologically. That was true during the Qing dynasty, and the Americans were working with the Qing reformers to that end. That was true throughout the Republican period, when the Americans were supporting the Chiang Kai-shek regime to that end. And it's true after 1979 with the People's Republic of China. That's the first strategy. Second strategy has been to liberalize China politically and socially. Notice I did not say democratize. I said liberalize. There's a difference. Liberalization is a step on the way to democratization. No American, I mean, yes, some Americans have written about, oh, when China becomes a democracy, well, good luck. I don't know any serious American or other who really thinks that China was on the path to democracy as is really defined. Liberalize, yes. And then the third goal and strategy was to integrate and socialize China into the international order. What international order? The post-World War II liberal, again with a capital L, international order, from the San Francisco Conference on through until, I was going to say until today, but we all know what's happening with that order today, and that's not just the result of the Chinese undermining that order, it's a result of the Americans undermining that order. Let me be clear about that at the beginning. Anyway, that was the third goal. Bring China in, because it had been excluded from, for more than 2 decades, the international order. One can argue they excluded themselves. But after 1971, they joined the UN. After 1979, they progressively entered the international institutional order, multilateral order, that's what I'm talking about, to give them, their rightful place at the table, 1/5 of humanity. But also, once they're in, to let the order work on them, socialize them into what? Liberal principles, in which the order itself, norms, I should say, principles and norms. The order itself existed. And then the last element of the American strategy of engagement was to exchange, what I call engagement as process, exchange people between multiple professions and societies in both directions. So those are the 4 elements of engagement: to modernize, liberalize, socialize, and exchange with China. Yeah, that's my view. Others may disagree. But then the question becomes how to do it. Those are the goals. How do you implement that? Well, this, you probably can't read it, but I'll run through these quickly. First tactic, the 7 tactics, government to government institutionalization. To do what my former boss in the National Security Council and the Carter administration, and subsequently my PhD advisor, Michael Oxenberg, used to refer to as marrying bureaucracies together. Marrying bureaucracies together. You get the Transportation Ministry of China together with the Department of Transportation of the United States, the health authorities, every bureaucracy in the national governments to work together. Well, prior to normalization of relations, they didn't have any contact. If anything, they had negative missions, and their financial resources were put behind their negative missions to counter the other. So Oxenberg wanted to flip that from, to a more cooperative set of bureaucratic interactions. So national government to government institutionalization. Secondly, building society to society ties, and that includes subnational government institutionalization at the state and local levels. I know you're experiencing that here in Australia too, or have done. So first one was at the national level, second element was at the societal level. On the premise, again, that the more exchanges, the stronger and broader and deeper the relationship would be. Third tactic, create civil society in China. Why? Because experiences of many other countries, developing countries, former authoritarian countries that have turned democratic, and during the so-called third wave of democracies, civil society was one key feature of those societies on the developmental road to democracy. So the U.S. has tried many things through NGOs in particular to strengthen, create first and then strengthen civil society in China. In the 1980s, there was no civil society in China. So it's been a long project. Then fifth, to invest in and trade with China. Fine. Why? Why trade? Well, it's because Ricardo's law of comparative advantage, yes, but because the Americans wanted to contribute to the marketization of the Chinese economy. And thus the dismantling of, or the erosion of, the socialist planned economy. You might say, turn it into a capitalist economy. Well, yeah, or at least not such a strict planned socialist, more of a hybrid economy. I have problems with people who call China a capitalist economy, just as I do with people who say China should democratize. Neither are real. It's a hybrid. China's one big hybrid. As Rowan Collick and I have both written about. Okay, then last three, improve China's domestic governance and and professional capacity building. To train professionals in the government, in society, at all levels of government, so that their skill sets were commensurate with international skill sets, and they could therefore interact with their opposite numbers in other societies. That's what the Ford Foundation was doing, and universities. We've been training our universities, for decades, Chinese leaders in different ways, in executive education courses. And the Ford Foundation and others have been pouring millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into sending these people abroad for training. So that's capacity building. Sixth, building the rule of law in China. What kind of law? Western legal law. And lastly, last tactic, to educate Chinese students. Key tactic, of course, goes back to the 1870s when the first group of Chinese students came to the United States. But why train them? Well, so that they would learn whatever specialty they were there to study and would return to China to help their own country modernize in whatever field they were expert in, but also so they would become, hopefully, at least agents of political change. Having been exposed to a democratic society, civil society, open media, all the things that we know are associated with our societies, they'd experience it and they'd go back and somehow start working within their own system to introduce those elements. So those are the 7 tactics of engagement. Now, you can certainly question if these American assumptions and goals of engagement were misplaced or not. It's a fair discussion to have. But nonetheless, this has had a lot to do with how the 2 countries have interacted over time. The critics of engagement, in retrospect, would argue, modernize China, why? We've created a peer competitor. The Chinese and the United States are now the world's 2 leading superpowers, and they're at each other. Second, liberalize China. The critics would argue, well, good luck with this communist party, this Leninist state, which is resilient and strong and resistant. Critics would say, socialize China internationally? Good luck. And we've seen partial success here. China is in the international order. It has contributed to the strengthening of that order until the last 10 years. Now I am amongst those that see China trying to hollow out that order from within and set up an alternative order outside the Western liberal order. So, and exchanges, the critics would say, hugely asymmetrical in China's favor, numerically, certainly. And that China has benefited much more from exchanges than has the American side. No real reciprocity. So that's the critical argument against engagement. So in short, America's liberalism and expectations, liberal expectations, ran up against Chinese Leninism. And the latter stubbornly resisted America's attempts to change it. And we can understand, one can certainly understand why, because the CCP and the Chinese side have viewed this strategy of engagement as subversive ever since 1955, when John Foster Dulles testified in front of Congress and said it is America's policy to peacefully evolve communist states worldwide, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, developing world, China, peacefully evolve. In Chinese, that's 和平演变. 1955. So the Chairman Mao immediately gave a speech about it. That's been the Chinese default assumption ever since 1955. That's what the Americans are up to. That's what they want to do. They want to subvert us and peacefully evolve us. First, they try and fight wars against us in Korea and elsewhere, and that doesn't work. They're going to do everything they can to undermine us from within. Okay, so with an eye on the clock, let me try and really compress the rest of what I wanted to say. But I think this is really, to really understand the American engagement strategy requires understanding how long the Americans have been trying to change China. This is not recent stuff, ladies and gentlemen. This is not post-Jimmy Carter. This goes back some ways. It goes back to the 1800s. And here on the left, you have America's first ambassador to China, Anson Burlingame. And to the right, you have America's second ambassador to China, a man named J. Ross Brown. Both Burlingame and Brown advocated for changing China. They were very explicit about it. But they had 2 very different approaches, tactics to doing so, which the reason I tell you about these gentlemen is because their 2 different tactics have repeated themselves on and off again over the centuries ever since. Burlingame believed in what he called the cooperative policy, to work with the Qing dynasty reformers, Li Hongjiang, Zheng Guofan, and others, in what you might call patient paternalism, to work with the Chinese and let them drive the train, in essence, and be helpful around the edges where one could be. Don't force anything on the Chinese. Let them, he thought, Burlingame, these were serious reformers, they deserve support, and to work with them cooperatively. By contrast, Brown, he favored what he called the coercive policy, to pressure. He also believed China, the Qing, needed to reform, but he thought only through pressure would they reform. He didn't think they would do it on their own. So Burlingame indulged the Chinese, even learning the language, and the Qing court loved him so much that they appointed him as the representative of all foreign ambassadors and emissaries to China. we like you. You're working with us. You're trying to understand our culture. And most of the European, so Burlingame turned that down. But by contrast, Brown was condescending. He advocated tough diplomatic pressure, moral condemnation, and the threat of force. So these two tactics, cooperative versus coercive, we have seen repeat themselves over and over and over and over in the American approach to China ever since, right? I'm not going to pass any judgment on which one of these two we're in right now. We can talk about that. But the point here is that to change China is in the American DNA. Americans look at China unlike any other country on the planet for centuries. And Americans have been trying to change China for the better, modernize it, liberalize it, integrate it over 2 centuries. Okay, so I'm a little concerned about the time. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the present period and recent period that the book looks at. And in one of the chapters, well, the first half of the book briefly is a historical study of all the way through to the Obama administration, from the Qing, from Truman and Eisenhower, post-World War through Obama. Then there's a chapter on the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, a little brief section on the second Trump administration, which I managed to squeeze into the volume as it was at the printers going to press this winter. And then there are chapters on how the Americans have disengaged from China. One chapter called Inside the Beltway, how the national government, the Congress, the executive branch, the military, the intelligence, and the counterintelligence communities have all turned on China, so to speak. Next chapter is called Outside the Beltway, how non-governmental and other private sector actors in the United States, NGOs, universities, the business community, and American states have all turned away from China, become alienated from China. And so that's in the second half of the book. And then there's at the end, 2 chapters, one of which I will tell you a little bit about. Let's see. Oh, there's the outline of the book. Oh, shoot. Go back. Sorry. So there, I mean, you can see for yourselves how the chapters unfold. What I want to talk about is 8, basically, chapter 8, what I call the Great American China Policy Debate of recent years, which is in fact still ongoing. What should American policy be? Now, this is a debate taking place largely in international affairs, foreign policy circles, right, outside the government and inside the government. And I look very carefully at this debate, and I identify 5 different schools of thought. And I place different advocates into one of 5 schools. The first being what I call the stealthy rival school. And the idea for this group is that China has a secret grand strategy to undermine, overtake, and replace the United States as the world's principal power. For this school, all the dots of China's domestic and global behavior connect, and they point to a regime doing its best to undermine the United States and the global liberal order. That's the first school of thought. Second school of thought I describe as the comprehensive competition school, which is a loose coalition of those who argue the United States is locked into a series of seemingly zero-sum competitive relationships in different spheres, different functional spheres: security, diplomacy, commerce, technology and innovation, higher education, ideology and domestic politics, global governance, and many other areas. And therefore, it's comprehensive, the competition. Therefore, the United States, this school argues, needs to go on the offense against China, push back and resist the Chinese encroachment upon American interests in each of these areas. So that's the second school in the debate. Third school I identify as the re-engagement school. And these are individuals who argue the United States simply needs to get back to the old engagement strategy. Should never have abandoned it under Trump 1.0 and Biden, that the old strategy still serves the United States well, that China is not an adversary, or even a competitor, this school argues, and that the United States need to just sort of take a deep breath, re-extend a hand to Beijing, and re-engage with the People's Republic. Not surprisingly, the members of this school are those who are deeply involved in the engagement school. They just can't quite let go. So they don't seem to know the famous aphorism from John Maynard Keynes, who said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" These people have not changed their mind. The facts have changed, but they think engagement is still appropriate. Then there's a fourth school, which is a slight variant of the re-engagement school I call the strategic empathy school. And these individuals think that China is only reacting to assertive and aggressive American actions. And the United States thus needs to better understand China's insecurities, not provoke them, not demonize China, but rather to be strategically empathetic. Don't push their buttons, so to speak. And the last school is the managed competition school, who believe and argue that competing against China and protecting American national interests should be pursued, and assertively so. But at the same time, a number of what you might call guardrails, buffers, off-ramps, and dialogue mechanisms need to be constructed between the two sides so that the relationship, which is described as a competitive relationship, is not yet an adversarial relationship. There is a difference. It doesn't become an adversarial relationship, this school argues, because an adversarial relationship could truly end in war, cataclysmic war. So these are 5 schools, but I think this gives you insight, hopefully, here in Australia about how these Americans across the Pacific think about China. So I'm going to not go on for the sake of time. I think I've exceeded it a little bit already, except to conclude by saying that there's an appendix in the book which flips the script and looks at China's America specialists, a subject about which I wrote my own doctoral dissertation more than 4 decades ago. So I've been watching China's America watchers for a very long time. They didn't understand America very well then in the 1980s, and ladies and gentlemen, I hate to tell you, they still don't understand America very well. I'll tell you, many Americans have puzzles too. But these, so I dig into all Chinese language materials, a body of, I read Chinese, okay, so a body of publications that nobody's really looked at before over the last decade or so, of what they write about the US, about the American engagement strategy, what was it intended to do, and why have these crazy Americans flipped over the last decade and become so hostile towards us. So what I find is that in this large body of literature, much of it what the Chinese call neibu, internal publications, this is a massive intelligence failure on the Chinese part. They just missed it, the undercurrents of discontent with the relationship during the Obama years in particular. Americans were complaining and debating the efficacy of engagement way before Trump came to office in 2017. You know, what are we getting out of this? And as I say, a lot of institutional participants were in their own ways becoming alienated from, having difficulties with their counterparts in the PRC. So does the Chinese side accept any responsibility for the profound shift in American attitudes and policies towards disengagement? Answer is short, resounding, no, none, zero. I found one article in this large literature, one interesting professor who actually said, yeah, you know, I think we've had something to do with the American reactions. As far as these America specialists are concerned, it's the deterioration of the relationship over the last 10 years is 100% the fault of the United States. It would behoove the Chinese side, I think, to read this book, although I don't anticipate they may read it, but they're not going to translate it into Chinese. It doesn't reflect very well on them. But, you know, if they're trying to understand the United States, this might help them. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry, Alistair and John, I've gone on a little over time, but welcome all of your questions. And and we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
David, thank you. Absolutely. Well, no need to apologise at all. It's a massive topic we got through. So, John, we're going to come to you quickly, and then we've got a roving microphone. If you just state your with that, then state your name and keep it to a brief question. We'll wrap the formal proceedings at 2 o'clock, and then we can stick around and chat to David after that, if you like. So, John, go ahead, please.
I simply want to offer a word of thanks here. A model class, David. Thank you very much. Informative, open-minded, while offering a historical perspective going way beyond history to give us analysis and modelling of the nature of engagement, the drivers of engagement, at least on the United States side, the tactics and the aims. There's more to be said about the China side as well, and whether those aims were or were not shared on both sides. And David addresses some of that in the final part of the book. Thank you very much, David. Now, questions. Will we start here in the front? We have about 10 minutes, am I right?
Yeah, 10 minutes, but then, you know, if we need to chat after that, we'll wrap the webinar at 2 o'clock, to be said, but
Thanks
very much.
Take a
Thanks.
couple, three together, and then whatever.
Thanks very much, and thanks so much. Really a masterclass. And I'm going to ask a question coming out of this book, another one, China's Communist Party, because David was actually the pioneer in really taking the party seriously. This book published in 2007, eight, I think. And to what extent is the problem from the American side in dealing with China, and the same for Australia, that we're dealing only with a single organisation, that the party is jealous, the party is pervasive, and that increasingly, however much people try to build on personal contacts and organisational contacts, all devolves to the party, and increasingly accountability, of course, goes from the bottom up in China, not the top down, and so it's very difficult to engage. Whereas America is still, even today, very diverse. That's my question. Just a brief one. Wang Huning, very important ideological Tsar, or whatever you call him in China, on the Politburo Standing Committee, wrote a book about America, wondering whether he's to blame partly for getting America wrong. Thanks.
Thank you. Rowan Kelly, would you please give your name before asking? I'm going to keep it brief. Thank you.
John. Well, thank you, David, and welcome in Melbourne. David and I were students together at Peking University. Now, you may not remember, but we were students together in 1983, 84. And I still remember David was the only American student who was invited to the banquet hosted by Ronald Reagan in 1984 in Peking. My question, David, is, if I remember correctly, about a decade ago, you wrote an article, may have been in the New York Times or Washington Post, where you said it was the beginning of the end of the regime in Beijing. And given where we are in the China-US relationship at this stage, I wonder where you think that is. I mean, in terms of the stability of the regime.
One more question.
Okay.
I'm Galina from Ukraine. So my question about Ukraine. If the United States steps back from Ukraine, Europe becomes weak and have not resources to help Ukraine. Do you think China might want to play the role of peace mediator, not to help, but to increase its influence? And the second, is the global order shifting in China's favor when China becomes the first?
Thank you.
Okay.
David.
Well, ma'am, I'm sorry, but I really don't. I mean, the book is not about Ukraine. Your question is a very valid one. I'm sure if there were some settlement of the conflict, of the aggression by Russia against your country, if there were some settlement, the first outside actor who would queue up to help in the reconstruction of your country would be China. Because there's money to be made. And where there's money to be made, there's influence to be had. So it would be an opportunistic. Don't make no mistake when the Chinese come knocking on your door. They're not there because they're friends. And let's be very candid. This invasion, and aggression, well, it has been enabled by the People's Republic of China, full stop. Putin would have done it anyway. There's no evidence that Xi Jinping tried to talk him out of it, nor talk him down from it once he launched it. He's had multiple opportunities, and we know about all the Chinese support for the Russian defense industries and drones and other things. So, you know, this conflict has gone on in part because of China. Okay, let's make no mistake about that. Okay, but that's not my expertise. Now, these two other questions are very interesting because they kind of tie together because they're about the party. I do remember you, gosh. You will be interested in a story. You raised the state visit to Ronald Reagan in 1984. There's a story I tell in chapter 4 of the book that I'll just tease the audience here to maybe go out and buy a copy of the book. During that visit, I might have saved President Reagan from an assassination attempt on his life. It's all in the book, but do you remember two of our classmates, Nazir and Wilfredo?
Yes, very much so.
You guys want to hear this story?
Yep.
Yes. We're going to have to extend by a couple minutes.
Go for it.
I'll give you the short description, but it's a true story. I've told in print for the first time in this book. I've told friends, and many friends have known about it over the years, but Chaz Freeman, a very famous American diplomat, can attest to the story. So about 5 days before Reagan arrived in Beijing, we were in a party, and I don't know if you were in the dorm room, in our Peking University dormitory room, you know, probably 15 people crammed into this small space, drinking beer, smoking cigarettes, very loud. I was seated between two young ladies from Czech Republic, from Czechoslovakia, as it was then called. I don't know if you remember Hannah and Lucy. And I was talking to them. And then on my right were Nazir and Wilfredo. So Nazir was a Palestinian, member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. Today we would call that a terrorist organization. And Wilfredo was a member of the Shining Path guerrilla movement. He was Venezuelan. Both these guys had been brought to China for guerrilla training. Yeah, seriously. And they had gone to these camps in Hunan province to, in theory, go back to their homelands and wage war. But they stayed on in China, didn't return to their homelands. They went to Peking University. And so I'm seated between these two. And I heard Nazir say to Wilfredo in Chinese, because that was their common language. 你知道下个礼拜美国总统到北京来访华. Next week, you know, President Reagan's coming to Beijing. And then Nazir says, there's a kind of pregnant pause, and he says, 很容易杀他. It would be very easy to kill him. Sha means same term for assassinate and kill. And I thought, well, I leaned over. I didn't confront him. I was shocked to hear this. And then he starts gesticulating like he's shooting a rifle. And he tells Wilfredo, 李根在长城饭店讲话，在大礼堂从那个英台能杀他. In other words, Reagan's going to give a speech in the atrium at the Great Wall Sheraton Hotel, in the atrium, and there are all these balconies up around the atrium, and it'd be easy to get up at one of the upper balconies and shoot him. I'm not kidding. And that really disturbed me, but I still didn't turn and confront him. I left the room shortly thereafter. And then I told my wife this story because she was a student at a different university in Beijing. And about a day later, I was in my dorm room and the phone rang. We didn't have phones in our room. We had one phone in the entire dormitory down on the first floor, but you had a buzzer system. So if you were buzzed, you go downstairs, pick up the phone. And my wife said, oh, you know, I was just at the Great Wall Sheraton Hotel shopping, because that's one of the few places you could buy imported goods in Beijing in those days. And she said, I saw Nazir walking around the balconies, around the atrium. This is only 36 hours after I'd heard him describe this to Wilfredo. I mean, at first I thought it was just a drunken, crazy anti-American conversation, but then he's pacing the balconies. And so I thought, oh, I've got to do something about this. So I got on my trusty flying pigeon bicycle and rode straight down to the American embassy, which you could do in about 30 minutes in those days. And the only person I knew in the American Embassy, thank you for indulging me on time, I'll try and be brief, was the cultural affairs officer who was in charge of us students on the national program. So I told this gentleman the story I just told you, and he says, David, stay right here. And I sat down in his office. He left. He came back a few minutes later with these two gentlemen in dark suits and narrow ties. You know, classic Americans, we call them G-men. They were part of the Secret Service advance team. They're in Beijing in advance of the president's visit. And Leon said, please tell these gentlemen what you just told me. So I told the story again. And then they said, stay right here. And they all left the room. So I'm sitting there nervously thinking I'm in trouble somehow. And then they come back with this sort of burly gentleman. So this is Mr. Freeman, the deputy chief of mission, Chaz Freeman, in case that name means anything to any of you. Very famous American diplomat. He was Nixon's interpreter in 1972 on Nixon's trip to China. But he was the deputy chief of mission. Ambassador Hummel was out of town. They said, tell Mr. Freeman the story you just told us. So I told Chaz, he said, okay, David, thank you for your patriotism. Don't tell anybody else. Just get back on your bicycle, go back to the university. We'll take it from here. Well, it turns out.
David, could I just say, we're just going to have to log off online. So all online viewers who want to hear the end of the story, you know how.
It's an incentive to buy the book. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. But, well, it turns out what they did. So the American Embassy told the public security authorities in China about it. And the PSB, the Public Security Ministry, basically swept all of the universities, technical universities mainly, in the northwest part of the city. You know, their students who were there to study STEM subjects, largely health. If you came from a country below the equator, today we call it the global south, you were put on a train for a mandatory 2-week holiday to Yantai, hundreds of miles out of Beijing. They pulled buses up to the universities, put all these kids on the buses, took them straight to the train station and sent them to Yantai for 2 weeks. I'm not kidding. Now, and to this day, these kids, you weren't taken, I don't think. No. They'd wonder, why did we have that 2-week holiday? Well, it turns out Chaz told me subsequently that the American Embassy, or no, the Public Security Ministry had also reports of an Iranian possible assassination attempt against Reagan on that trip. So there were two. Anyway, that's the Reagan story. Sorry to indulge you. Yeah. It's all in chapter 4, and it's true. As for the Communist Party, yes, I mean, the Communist Party is a Leninist institution built on norms and different levers. And it is always a Leninist institution, but it's led by different leaders who have more or less reformist inclinations. And I would argue that Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao all had reformist inclinations, which is what that's adaptation part of the previous book was about. Yes, they were Leninists, but they believed that the society and the party needed to open to survive. And I would argue they all largely instituted reformist opening policies. Xi Jinping is completely different. The CCP has oscillated back and forth over 40 years, at least, from what they call Fang, to open, and Shou, to close. Fang, Shou, Fang, Shou. So it's been a repetitive cycle. When the Chinese are in a Fang phase, it's very easy for the Americans and the rest of us to work with them, support their internal reforms. When they're in Shou, as they've been for the last 13 years under Xi Jinping, there's no scope for interaction. The Chinese have shut down the channels for cooperation and institutionalization. That's why I say China broke the relationship. Xi Jinping broke the relationship of the engagement. So, I don't know, Wall Street Journal article, that was not a prediction. The title was put on it by the Wall Street Journal, The Coming Crack Up of China. That was not my title, and it was not my argument of the article. If you read the article, it's very similar to the Atrophy and Adaptation book, is that the CCP was atrophying. And unless it did A, B, C, and D, it might wind up like the Soviet Union. So in fact, I saw many of the same problems in the party that Xi Jinping himself saw. I wouldn't have counseled Xi to undertake the same steps he has done, But it was not a prediction of the demise of the party. It was a trend analysis. So that's, I guess, how I'd respond to the two of you.
Okay. Can I see if we'd have one last question and then we'll wrap, and then feel free to come and chat to David one-on-one.
Brett Ross Handler is my name. Two short questions. So did Nixon and Kissinger make a mistake? One. And secondly, comment please on the vulnerability of Australia.
Oh, well, they're very good. Interesting. I don't think Kissinger and Nixon made a mistake. It was sort of handwriting on the wall. Certainly strategically because of this common Soviet threat to both countries at the time. But also, as I show in the book, I look very carefully, in fact, at the 1960s in American society. There were a number of groups who were advocating for an opening to China 10 years before Nixon went to China. So in some ways, he was pushing on an open door in American society, a number of NGOs and other groups. So I think it was it was a brilliant strategic opening, but you know, there was something inevitable about it too. And it launched engagement, and engagement was successful more or less for 40 years, but it ran its course. Now, vulnerability of Australia, I don't know. The Chinese would say, I don't want to interfere in your internal affairs. I really don't. It's not for me to say, but well, I'll put it this way. I think all countries are vulnerable to China. China's external interference and influence activities are real, and espionage activities, cyber and other malign instruments that they use all over the world. Nobody is exempted, including Russia. A very interesting article last week about how the Chinese are penetrating the Russian internal security services at the same time that they're lips and teeth brothers over Ukraine. So we're all vulnerable, and we've all got to be alert, and our domestic security organs have got to be on highest alert about different tactics and instruments that the Chinese United Front, intelligence, media, corporate, and other actors all use in foreign societies, including this one. I know you are. This was Prime Minister Turnbull's original doing was in Ross Garnaut, you know, in the foreign interference legislation that has now been passed. And there's a much higher awareness in this country now than thanks to Prime Minister Turnbull and Ross Garnaut and others. And John Fitzgerald, amongst others, who have alerted your society to these activities. So we have to be alert to them. We have to control them, monitor them, rebuff them. At the same time, learn to have some types of exchanges with China. You can't just turn off relationships. You just have to be vigilant. So my impression is that Australia is being quite vigilant.
Well, David, thank you so much. It's covered a huge amount of territory. It's been a privilege to have your insights. Thank you for coming to see us. And audience, please join me in giving a big thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.